The first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, stretching long fingers of gold, and rose across the endless expanse of the Mongolian steppe. The grass, short and sparse in some places, taller and swaying in others, glimmered with dew, each droplet capturing the newborn sun in its tiny prism. The cold lingered in the air, sharp and unyielding, brushing against the skin of those already awake. Horses shifted restlessly within their small herds, breaths rising in delicate clouds that mingled with the lingering mist, forming ephemeral veils that drifted across the frozen earth. Every exhalation seemed to blend into the soft rhythm of the land, the subtle thrum of life stirring in tandem with the wind. The soundscape was delicate yet precise. Hooves pressed into frozen ground with a faint crunch, a whisper more than a sound, echoing across the gentle undulations of the plain. Occasionally, the metallic clink of harness fittings, the subtle brush of leather against hide, punctuated the early morning. Far off, a single bird rose from the grass, wings slicing the crisp air before settling again, invisible to the wandering eye but present in the listener's memory. A slow, rolling fog shifted with the movement of the steppe, curling around low hills and nestling into the folds of the earth, hinting at the subtle undulations of the landscape. Nomadic families stirred quietly within the felt tents that dotted the horizon. Smoke lifted from small hearths, curling lazily toward the sky, carrying with it the aroma of early meals, warm milk from mares, roasted grains, and the faint, lingering tang of drying dung fires. Women moved with careful, practiced motions, arranging utensils, tending fires, checking the youngest children with soft gestures that carried reassurance rather than urgency. Men led the horses to the grazing fields, their hands brushing over the hides with gentle familiarity, testing the animals' readiness for the day. Every movement was deliberate, measured, in tune with the subtle pulse of life that defined the steppe. There was no rush here, only rhythm, the repetition of essential tasks that preserved life and nurtured continuity. As the horizon slowly brightened, revealing the vastness of the plains, a young boy squatted beside the herd, tracing the dew-laden grass with his fingertips. Each blade bent and returned with a soft shiver, cold and flexible under his touch. He observed the horses, muzzles dipping into frost-tipped grass, the gentle rise and fall of their flanks with breath and movement. In this quiet observation, he began to understand something that had been taught not in words but in action: the subtle, unwavering dialogue between animal and human, between man and the land. Life on the steppe depended not only on strength and skill, but on patience and attunement, on listening to the rhythm of hoofbeats, the shift of wind, the pattern of frost, and the slow, cyclical passage of time. The wind carried scents that told stories of the night. Damp soil, pressed by the weight of snow and dew, released a soft, earthy perfume. The faint, almost imperceptible tang of animal musk drifted from the herd, mingling with the smoky aroma of burnt dung from the fire pits, a smell that was both comforting and grounding. Somewhere beyond the nearest rise, a distant stream murmured, water flowing with a gentle persistence, unseen but audibly present, a reminder that life on this vast plain was anchored in motion, and that the flow of rivers and seasons would shape human activity in ways both subtle and profound. The elders emerged from the tents, their faces lined with years of observing the land. They walked slowly, deliberately, pausing occasionally to watch the herd, noting its composition, the condition of the foals, the gloss of coats, and the tension in muscles. Each step seemed to mark a beat in the quiet rhythm of the morning, their senses attuned to the nuances of the steppe. Internal reflection took root here. The knowledge that existence in such an environment required observation, that survival was a matter of anticipating change and responding with a careful balance of patience and action. The young ones watched, absorbing gestures and glances, their understanding growing silently alongside the horses and the wind. As light continued to stretch across the horizon, it revealed the undulating patterns of frozen grass, patches of bare earth where the frost had yet to settle, and the faint trails of nocturnal animals, scrawled across the ground like a secret map. The villagers noted these signs, subtle indications of both opportunity and caution, each observation layering into a growing tapestry of knowledge that would guide decisions about movement, grazing, and defense. Reflection lingered on the intimacy of this connection. The steppe was not merely a backdrop but a participant in daily life, shaping decisions, guiding action, and teaching lessons in quiet insistence. Every breath taken by man and beast, every shift of hooves, every curl of smoke from a hearth, contributed to an ongoing meditation on existence in a land both beautiful and exacting. There was a recognition, unspoken and deeply felt, that mastery of this environment came not from domination but from harmony. Each individual's survival depended on understanding and respecting rhythms that were larger than any single person. The cadence of the wind through grass, the slow arc of the sun across the sky, the gentle rise and fall of temperature, the subtle cues of animals, and the eternal pulse of the land itself. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to burn away lingering fog, revealing the horizon stretching into distant hills, each one a gentle wave of earth against the sky. The horses grazed, noses low, swishing tails to keep flies at bay, while children practiced running in patterns around the tents, learning balance and stamina in the rhythm of play. Women moved between tents, carrying water and stirring fires, the subtle sounds of everyday life creating a quiet symphony, a repetition that bound each individual into the wider community. In these slow movements, there was instruction and observation. Each repeated action was a lesson, internalized without words. How to tend a fire, how to approach a horse without startling it, how to sense the approach of clouds or distant footsteps. The land itself became a teacher, and those who listened learned the rhythms of survival. Internal reflection merged with sensory experience. The weight of frost-laden grass beneath hands, the chill of morning wind on exposed skin, the warmth of a mare's breath against the palm, the subtle hum of a community in gentle, coordinated motion. As the morning stretched, a light wind swept across the plain, bending grass and carrying with it faint scents of distant water, wildflowers, and the faint hint of dung from far-off herds. The villagers paused, faces turned toward the wind, ears alert to subtle changes in sound and movement. A sense of patience settled over them, a quiet understanding that the day, like life on the steppe, would unfold according to rhythms not entirely their own, and that true mastery came from attunement rather than force. By the time the sun rose fully, warming the land and igniting the dew in 1,000 sparkling reflections, the families had completed the initial chores of the day. Fires were banked, animals fed, and the tents arranged against wind and sun. Yet even as they moved on to more active tasks, a slow, meditative awareness remained. Each movement, each breath, each gaze was part of a continuous conversation with the land, the animals, and one another. In this way, the Mongol people of the steppe learned not only to survive, but to move with the quiet, persistent rhythm that would, in centuries to come, define their ability to traverse vast distances with skill, patience, and uncanny precision. And so, as the morning light spilled fully across the whispering steppes, the delicate sounds of hooves, voices, and wind formed a soft, enduring hum, a reminder that life, though fragile and transient, followed patterns that could be learned, respected, and ultimately harmonized with. It was here, in this interplay of observation, patience, and quiet reflection, that the foundations of the Mongols, extraordinary mobility, cohesion, and subtle mastery of the land were first being laid, one gentle, deliberate, rhythmical morning at a time. The morning had settled fully over the steppe, sunlight spilling across the rolling grasslands, igniting dew into tiny sparks that danced with each subtle breeze. Horses, goats, and sheep began their day in gentle rhythm, noses lowered to the frost-tinged grass, tails flicking against insects, hooves pressing into the soft earth. The air carried the mingling scents of sweat, animal musk, and the subtle sweetness of freshly trodden grass, layered with the earthy undertone of frozen soil beginning to warm under the sun's caress. Each scent told a story, an intimate map of movement and health, of forage and grazing patterns, of proximity to water and shelter. The herds were guided slowly, methodically. Nomadic families moved alongside them, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the animals' routines. Leather harnesses shifted with quiet clinks, reins brushed against hides, soft and familiar. The children followed, small feet sinking into patches of soft mud or frozen soil, hands brushing over foals, manes, and the coarse fur of goats. Every action was an act of learning, a deliberate repetition that would, over time, shape instinct. In the gentle guidance of the animals, the young observed weight, balance, and timing, the rhythm of hoofbeats, the way a horse shifted with a pull of a rein, the subtle pressure of leather against skin. The elders, walking at the edges of the moving herds, moved with an almost imperceptible sway that matched the movement of the animals. They paused to observe the flock, noting which animals strayed, which foals lagged behind, and which older horses maintained an effortless pace. They listened to the clatter of hooves, the faint rattle of harness fittings, the soft bleating of goats and lambs, and the occasional snort or whinny. Each sound carried meaning, a signal of well-being or warning, of fatigue or readiness. Observation was a meditation, and in these early hours, the community rehearsed a slow, hypnotic choreography of life that combined patience, care, and subtle control. Children, learning by imitation, mirrored these movements with wide-eyed attentiveness. A boy ran alongside a young horse, hands brushing over its flanks, feeling the tautness of muscles under skin, the warmth of exertion radiating with each breath. His small fingers traced the coarse hairs of a foal's mane, noting how it shivered in the cold morning, how its ears flicked at sound, how its gaze followed the elder's instructions. Behind him, a girl held the reins of a goat, laughing softly as it tugged and twisted, teaching her balance, coordination, and the gentle art of persuasion without force. These small, repeated exercises in rhythm and touch were lessons that went far beyond livestock. They were lessons in movement, observation, and unconsciously in the coordinated skill that would later translate to horseback warfare. The steppe itself seemed to participate in the exercise, responding to each hoofbeat, each rustle of fur. The wind carried scents in shifting ribbons, scents of distant water, the faint tang of wildflowers, the musky trace of predators or scavengers lingering in the brush. Grass bent and swayed, brushing against ankles, clinging to leather boots, and leaving its impression on hands that passed over it in care or play. Dust rose gently in patches where hooves had pressed into softer soil, creating a moving haze that shimmered in the morning light. Every detail was observed, every movement recorded in quiet attentiveness, a meditation on coordination, timing, and the delicate relationship between human and animal. The adults moved with a careful, unspoken understanding. No words were needed to guide the herd. Subtle gestures, a tilt of a head, a slight lift of a hand, a careful shift in weight, communicated intent. The soft stamping of hooves, the brush of animals against each other, the rhythmic swish of tails, and the clatter of bells and harness fittings formed a symphony of quiet instruction. In these moments, patience became a virtue not spoken, but felt, an understanding that the tempo of life on the steppe was dictated by the balance between care, observation, and timing. Feeding was an act of deliberate attentiveness. Watering stations were chosen with consideration. Shallow streams where the animals could drink without crowding, small depressions where snow had melted into pools, patches of frost-free earth where grass had begun to sprout. Hands lifted gourd or wooden buckets, offering fresh water to foals and goats alike, while elders guided animals to suitable grazing patches, sometimes nudging with gloved hands, sometimes calling softly. The repeated motion of scooping, offering, and watching became a quiet rhythm, reinforcing a bond between caretaker and herd, a subtle practice in trust and attention that transcended mere survival. The movement of the herds also created lessons in timing and strategy. Children watched how older animals led, how younger ones followed, and how the placement of a single figure could influence the direction of the group. Subtle adjustments, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, ensured that stragglers were kept within the group, that predators had little opportunity, and that the herd maintained momentum across miles of open terrain. In each of these observations, reflection arose. Life on the steppe was not a matter of force, but of anticipation, subtle communication, and the deep understanding of rhythm. The lessons of mobility were already embedding themselves in the youngest generation, forming a foundation of skill that would later find expression in movement, coordination, and the discipline of mounted warfare. The sensory details of this early morning were rich and continuous. The sun, inching higher, warmed the frostbitten grass, releasing a faint, sweet scent. The combined aromas of animal, soil, and water formed a tapestry that lingered in the mind as much as it did in the air. Each inhalation carried information: the health of the herd, the proximity of water, the direction of the wind, the subtle signs of other animals or humans nearby. Eyes scanned continuously, hands touched and adjusted, feet moved carefully in step with the rhythms around them. Observation became a meditative act, awareness itself a skill honed as naturally as riding or herding. In quiet moments, elders would pause, one hand resting on a horse's mane, gaze sweeping the horizon. Internal reflection merged with sensory input. They noted the subtle changes in the landscape, the gentle undulations of hills and valleys, the distant glint of a stream or lake. The wind shifted, carrying scents and sounds that demanded attention. It was here, in these brief pauses of stillness amid motion, that the deeper lessons of life on the steppe became evident. Coordination, patience, and attentiveness were as necessary for survival as speed, strength, or courage. Children absorbed these lessons without instruction. Mimicking actions and observing outcomes, they learned the importance of timing, of pressure, of rhythm. A gentle nudge, a soft tug on reins, a slight correction in direction, all became part of a growing internal understanding of movement, balance, and anticipation. The repetition of these small, daily acts, so seamlessly woven into life on the steppe, created an intuitive knowledge that would one day translate into the remarkable mobility and coordination that defined the Mongol horsemen. As the morning progressed, the herds continued across the steppe, leaving faint impressions in the soft ground, trails that would later guide movement and mark territory. The clatter of hooves and the soft bleating of livestock merged with the whisper of wind through grass, forming a gentle, continuous rhythm. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the dewdrops still clinging to tall blades, warming leather and felt, inviting the first stretches and yawned breaths of humans and animals alike. Observation and reflection continued. Every sound, every scent, every movement carried meaning, and those who paid attention absorbed the pulse of life, learning the patience and subtlety that the environment demanded. By midday, the herds had been guided over several miles, settled in new grazing grounds, and positioned near water sources. Elders and adults moved with practiced ease, their motions repeating patterns established over generations. Children, tired but attentive, rested briefly while watching foals romp, learning once again the connection between energy, direction, and response. The quiet, deliberate repetition, the synchronized dance of human and animal, became both instruction and meditation, creating the framework of understanding that made mobility, observation, and coordination instinctual rather than learned in abstract theory. The steppe seemed alive with these patterns, responding to the careful rhythm of movement. Dust lifted faintly in the sun, carried across low hills by gentle gusts. The distant line of a river glimmered faintly, promising water and shelter. Animals settled to graze, hooves pressing into earth that retained the memory of their passage, while humans adjusted gear, checked water supplies, and prepared for the next stage of movement. The cycle, repeated over hours, days, and years, formed the invisible curriculum through which the Mongols learned not only to survive, but to move with precision, patience, and enduring rhythm. In these early hours of guiding herds, one could glimpse the beginnings of a society in motion, a society built on observation, repetition, and subtle communication, a society where the knowledge of the land, the herd, and the wind became intertwined with identity, skill, and preparation for challenges yet to come. It was here, amid the clinking harnesses, shifting hooves, and quiet murmurs of animals and humans, that the Mongols honed the patience, coordination, and subtle control that would allow them to traverse vast distances, maintain cohesion, and ultimately, centuries later, form a force that moved across continents with the precision of a silent storm. As the sun climbed steadily over the horizon, the steppe shifted from the quiet shimmer of dawn to the soft warmth of morning light. The dew that had clung to the blades of grass began to evaporate, releasing a faint, sweet scent that mingled with the earthy aroma of trampled soil and the subtle musk of animals stirring in their enclosures. Within the circular walls of felt tents, the daily rhythms of nomadic life unfolded with quiet precision. Smoke curled in thin, pale spirals from small hearths at the center of each dwelling, carrying the scent of simmering milk, roasted grains, and dried herbs. The movement of smoke seemed almost deliberate, as though tracing the slow rise of the sun itself, marking the passage of time with each gentle spiral. Inside the tents, women moved with a careful rhythm honed through repetition and observation. One kneaded a ball of dough, her fingers pressing slowly, deliberately, over the rough, warm surface. The texture of the flour, fine and powdery, sifted through her hands as she worked, interspersed with the occasional grit of steppe sand that clung stubbornly to skin and fabric. The repetitive motion of kneading became almost meditative, a tactile language through which she communicated with the land, the animals, and the family she sustained. Nearby, another woman ground grains on a flat stone, the rhythmic scrape of the quern echoing softly through the tent, punctuated by the occasional clatter as a small stone rolled free. Each repetition, each motion, was part of a larger, deliberate choreography, a ritual that reinforced endurance, patience, and attentiveness. Men attended to other necessary tasks, moving with quiet deliberation. A father repaired leather harnesses, hands flexing to soften the hide, ears attuned to the soft creaks and cracks of stressed material. His gaze traced each seam, each stitch, noting imperfections and adjusting with precise, repeated movements. Outside the tents, another tended to animals, brushing dust and dirt from the coats of horses and goats. The tactile feedback of brushing fur, feeling the warmth of muscles beneath skin, listening to the soft snorts and shifts of animals under touch, became a constant exercise in perception and care. Every day, every gesture, contributed to the maintenance of life and the reinforcement of social cohesion. The tactile textures of felt, leather, and wood created a subtle landscape within each tent. Hands brushed over the coarse, insulating walls of felt, feeling its tight weave and natural pliability. Wooden utensils, smoothed by years of use, rested in bowls or hung on pegs, waiting to be employed. The smell of recently cured leather mingled with the scent of cooking grains and milk, creating a layered sensory experience. Children, too, were part of this unfolding world. They clutched small wooden tools or toy animals, mimicking the precise, measured movements of their parents, learning by imitation how each gesture, how a press, a stroke, a scoop, was connected to the survival and rhythm of life. The repetition of daily rituals, preparing food, tending animals, mending tools, and cleaning tents, was a form of meditation. Time seemed to expand as small tasks were performed over and over, each motion reinforcing attentiveness and resilience. One could sense the continuity of generations in these actions. The same movements had been performed for decades, perhaps centuries, each repetition contributing to a collective memory of survival, efficiency, and harmony with the steppe. Even the smallest acts, a child carefully stacking firewood, a woman adjusting the placement of a bowl, a man testing the tension of a harness strap, were imbued with intention, teaching focus, patience, and awareness. The domestic environment extended beyond the physical confines of the tents. The steppe itself formed a backdrop of quiet observation and subtle guidance. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of nearby herds, the faint aroma of wild grasses, and the distant note of running water. The ground beneath each tent bore impressions of movement, softened trails from the night's animals, and marks left by repeated footfalls. Even in moments of rest, the community remained attuned to these signals. The distant snort of a horse, the flap of a bird's wings, or the soft rustle of the grass under shifting wind. In these environmental cues lay lessons about timing, anticipation, and the ongoing balance between human activity and nature's rhythms. Meals were prepared with meticulous care, not only to sustain the body but to reinforce social bonds. A mother poured milk into small bowls, watching as the liquid shimmered with tiny beads of condensation in the morning light. Children sat cross-legged, hands reaching for morsels, their movements slow and attentive, their senses engaged with taste, smell, and texture. Each sip of milk, each bite of grain was a sensory lesson, teaching appreciation for sustenance, patience in consumption, and the reward of attention to small daily acts. Meals were more than nourishment. They were the repetition of ritual, a subtle meditation that reinforced cohesion and order. The repetition extended to clothing and personal care. Women mended garments with precise stitches, their fingers moving in quiet rhythm, tracing patterns that ensured warmth and durability. Men repaired tools, the sound of scraping, sanding, and hammering creating a steady, hypnotic backdrop. Children played, but even play reflected imitation. Mock tasks, miniature tools, and scaled versions of adult gestures taught coordination, skill, and mindfulness. Each act of repetition, whether necessary for survival or incorporated into the rhythms of daily play, reinforced the subtle structures of communal life. In these slow, deliberate movements, a foundation of resilience emerged. Each task, each repeated motion, was a lesson in preparation, foresight, and attention to detail. The repetition of chores, intertwined with observation of animals, weather, and terrain, developed an intuition that would later guide hunting, herding, and, eventually, military strategy. Patience, the careful sequencing of action, and the mindfulness cultivated through repeated domestic rituals became a form of quiet education, preparing each member of the community for the demands of life on the steppe. The visual landscape within the tents mirrored this rhythm. Hearths glowed with a steady warmth, illuminating the soft textures of felt walls and the subtle colors of utensils, fabrics, and animal hides. The flickering light highlighted the deliberate motions of hands at work, casting slow-moving shadows that seemed to dance in time with labor. Each movement, each shadow, reinforced the perception that life was an ongoing performance of careful attention, harmonized with the cycles of nature and the repeated acts of survival. Outside, the herds grazed quietly nearby, their movements gentle but deliberate, forming an ever-present backdrop to domestic life. The faint rattle of harnesses, the soft shuffle of hooves, and the occasional whinny or bleat blended with the warmth and aroma of tents to create an immersive soundscape. Even as attention focused on the rituals within, the steppe's presence remained constant, offering subtle lessons about timing, observation, and the interconnectedness of human and animal activity. As the day progressed, small adjustments maintained balance and rhythm. Water containers were refilled, grains were stirred, animals were brushed and led to sunlit patches. Each action flowed seamlessly into the next, forming a continuous cycle of care, observation, and repetition. The seamless continuity was both calming and instructive, embedding a sense of order, attentiveness, and resilience into the community. Internal reflection deepened as the tasks continued. One could see how survival depended not only on strength or courage, but on the quiet mastery of time, movement, and attention. Each repeated gesture carried purpose, Each observation, whether of animal, whether or fellow human, informed decisions and guided action. The community, through ritual, repetition, and attentiveness, transformed the harsh, vast steppe into a managed, comprehensible, and habitable environment. By late morning, the rhythm of tent life had become almost meditative. Smoke curled higher, sunlight warmed the felt, and the steppe beyond continued its gentle sway. Children had begun to absorb the subtleties of domestic practice, the timing of grinding grain, the gentle pressure required to knead dough, the careful threading of needle through leather. Observation and imitation merged with practice, creating a foundation of skill, patience, and communal cohesion that would later extend into every other aspect of life, including mobility, strategy, and leadership. The steppe, in turn, responded to these rhythms. Grass bent under grazing hooves, dust rose in faint wisps where children had run, and the wind carried scents across distance. Every element, tent, hearth, animal, human, participated in a slow, hypnotic interplay. The lessons of attentiveness, repetition, and careful observation were imprinted not just on bodies and minds, but on the landscape itself. The steppe became a living teacher, offering constant feedback and encouraging the cultivation of skill, patience, and harmonious movement. In this continuous cycle of preparation, care, and observation, the nomadic community discovered the quiet power of routine. The seemingly ordinary tasks of daily life, grinding, mending, cooking, feeding, became exercises in focus, endurance, and cooperation. Over time, these repeated patterns embedded in each member a deep understanding of timing, patience, and coordination, forming the foundation of the skills that would later allow the Mongols to move across continents with unparalleled precision and effectiveness. By midday, the tents glowed in the bright sun, the hearth smoldered, and the steppe stretched endlessly in every direction, alive with subtle movement and sound. Within the tents, life continued, each repeated motion reinforcing the lessons of the past and preparing the community for challenges to come. In this way, the intimate, sensory-rich, repetitive rituals of daily domestic life became as vital as the open plains themselves, a quiet, patient training ground for survival, adaptability, and skill. As the mid-morning sun rose higher over the endless steppes, the air warmed, shifting the texture of the grass beneath the feet of those who moved quietly across the plains. Hunters and scouts departed from the central encampment with deliberate caution, their eyes sweeping over the gentle undulations of the terrain, ears attuned to the softest disturbances. The world of the steppe was alive with subtle signals. A bird taking flight with a sudden beat of wings, a tuft of grass bending against the wind, or the faint indentation of hoofprints in frost-softened earth. Every movement, every sound, every scent carried meaning, and learning to read these signs required patience, repetition, and deep immersion in the environment. The first task of the morning was observation. A scout crouched low, letting the bend of the grass hide his figure. His eyes traced the landscape in deliberate sweeps, following the faint shimmer of a distant herd or noting the trace of smoke curling from a far-off camp. The wind shifted, and with it, the sense of the steppe traveled in unexpected directions. He breathed slowly, learning to distinguish between the aroma of grass, the subtle musk of grazing animals, and the faint trace of human presence. Each inhale was a lesson, a method of attuning body and mind to signals that might otherwise be overlooked. Footfalls were carefully measured. The scout's boots pressed gently into soil and frost, leaving faint impressions while avoiding broken twigs or dry grass that might betray his path. The sound of hooves or feet against the ground became an intimate part of the landscape, a rhythm repeated over years of practice until it merged with instinct. Small movements, adjusting a weight on the shoulder, shifting balance to peek around a rise, turning the head in unison with the wind, formed a choreography of vigilance and patience. Even the act of pausing, holding breath, and waiting for a sound to emerge from the silence became a skill, a training of awareness that extended beyond the individual into the collective consciousness of the horde. Tracking required the careful study of signs left by both animal and human activity. The subtle difference between the tracks of a young foal and an adult horse, the spacing of footprints in soft mud, or the way disturbed vegetation signaled recent passage, all of these cues were observed with meticulous attention. Scouts often crouched for long stretches, tracing impressions with fingers, feeling the subtle ridges and depressions, noting the direction and weight implied by each mark. Their reflections were quiet, internal meditations, the way a step could reveal speed, purpose, or even intent, the way a herd's movement could signal the changing seasons or the shifting availability of water and forage. The sensory environment extended far beyond sight. The wind, ever present on the plains, carried messages from distant ridges and valleys. A scout learned to interpret the way it carried dust, the scent of water, or the smell of animal sweat. Birds became allies and informants, their flight patterns hinting at the presence of prey or potential threats. Even the sound of grasses brushing against one another or the faint crunch of frost under hoof indicated direction and timing. Through careful observation of these cues, the scouts cultivated an awareness that seemed almost supernatural, yet was born of patience, repetition, and intimate familiarity with the land. Silence was an essential tool. The scouts moved with minimal speech, communicating through subtle gestures, a lift of the hand, a tilt of the head, a shift of weight. This silent language, honed over countless journeys across the plains, allowed for coordination without noise, ensuring that movements remained undetected by prey or rival clans. The repetition of these gestures, the constant practice of moving quietly, created a rhythm that extended to the entire group. Over time, each member internalized not only their own actions, but the expected movements of others, fostering an almost telepathic cohesion in the shared experience of observation and tracking. Observation extended beyond immediate survival needs. Scouts noted the changing patterns of rivers and streams, the growth of grasses and herbs, and the subtle migration of animals across the plains. These patterns became a map of the environment, a guide to the rhythms of life that dictated where the horde could move, where resources would be plentiful, and where danger might lie. Each reflection was slow, internal, a meditation on the interconnectedness of all things: wind, water, vegetation, animals, and humans. The act of reading the landscape became a spiritual as well as practical exercise, training the mind to perceive patterns that would later inform not just hunting, but the strategy and movement of entire armies. As the morning wore on, the scouts' senses became finely tuned instruments. They could detect the faintest variations in temperature, the slightest changes in soil moisture, and the subtlest traces of life hidden in the vast expanse. These repeated acts of careful observation, day after day, season after season, shaped the consciousness of the Mongol people. Patience was not merely a virtue, it was a necessity, a tool that allowed them to move undetected, to coordinate across distances, and to respond with precision when action was required. The scouts' internal reflections often wandered, even as their attention remained on the terrain. They considered the lessons of repetition, how movement, patience, and careful observation created mastery over the land, how the subtle interplay between silence and motion could determine life or death, how, in learning to read the world around them, they were simultaneously learning to read themselves and one another. Every trace left in the grass, every whisper of wind, became a meditation, reinforcing the connection between mind, body, and environment. The tactile sensations of the steppe were equally instructive. Fingers brushed over rough bark, smooth stones, and dry grasses to interpret their age, dryness, or prior disturbance. The weight of the bow in hand, the feel of the reins against taut fingers, and the balance required when moving over uneven terrain became extensions of perception. Each gesture was repeated countless times, embedding skill into muscle memory and creating a quiet harmony between human intention and environmental response. Even time itself seemed to slow during these excursions. Hours passed in near silence, punctuated only by subtle signs: the distant whinny of a horse, the flutter of wings above, or the faint smell of approaching rain carried on shifting air. Scouts measured the movement of the sun across the sky, noting shadows and angles, and reflected on the patterns that would guide them later. Observation was not passive. It was an active dialogue with the world, a continuous process of attention, repetition, and reflection. Children sometimes followed at a safe distance, imitating the motions of elders. They crouched, paused, and scanned the horizon, learning to read footprints and disturbances, to detect changes in wind and scent. This apprenticeship was slow and immersive, a daily meditation in practice and reflection. Each repeated motion reinforced attentiveness, patience, and the disciplined mind required for survival on the open steppe. By observing and imitating, they absorbed not just the skills of tracking, but the subtle ethos of their people. The harmony between speed and caution, presence and invisibility, observation and action. The narrative of tracking and observation extended into evenings as well. Reports were relayed back to the main camp with careful, quiet precision. Scouts recounted movements of herds, signs of rival clans, or the locations of water sources. Their voices were measured, soft, often accompanied by gestures pointing to maps or marking positions with sticks. Every retelling was deliberate, each repetition reinforcing understanding and embedding the lessons of the landscape into collective memory. Through these repeated acts of attentiveness, the Mongols cultivated skills that would later enable them to navigate vast territories with precision and foresight. Patience and observation, honed over years of quiet immersion, became the foundation of military strategy, herding efficiency, and social cohesion. The steppe itself was both teacher and partner, offering continuous feedback, requiring discipline, and shaping the rhythms of life. By late afternoon, the scouts returned to camp, their eyes still tracing the contours of the land, their senses alert to the faintest signals. The soft sounds of tent life, fires crackling, animals shifting, utensils scraping, blended with their reports, creating a rich tapestry of perception and practice. Internal reflection lingered on the quiet lessons of the day. That movement must be deliberate, observation constant, and action informed by countless repetitions of attention and awareness. In these rituals, the Mongols learned the deep rhythms of the steppe, lessons that would carry them across continents with uncanny precision. The sun sank slowly toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. Every blade of grass, every indentation in soil, every distant plume of smoke became part of the scouts' internal map. Their awareness extended beyond immediate survival into contemplation of the land, the animals, their people, and the subtle interplay of all these forces over time. Tracking and observation were not merely skills, they were meditative acts, exercises in patience, attentiveness, and alignment with the natural and human patterns of the world around them. As night approached, the scouts settled into the rhythm of return, moving in quiet formation back toward the warmth and bustle of the tents. The steppe, now cooling and shadowed, continued its subtle instruction. The whisper of wind through grasses, the distant call of a bird settling, the soft crunch of hooves on hardening earth. Every movement, every sound, every reflection reinforced the lessons of the day: patience, attentiveness, careful observation, and the quiet cultivation of skill. The steppe was not a passive backdrop. It was an active participant in the lives of those who traversed it. It demanded repetition, discipline, and mindfulness, teaching that mastery over the land, animals, and human activity came through immersion and reflection. The scouts had learned to move with subtlety, to perceive with depth, and to internalize the rhythms of the steppe. These skills would carry forward, informing not only survival but the strategies, coordination, and precision that would later define the Mongol horde as it moved like a silent storm across Asia. Morning unfolded across the endless steppe with a muted glow, the horizon stretching into a pale haze as the first hints of sunlight brushed over the frosted grass. The wind carried a chill, tugging lightly at the felt of tents and the loose manes of horses grazing nearby. Amidst this quiet expanse, small groups of warriors began to gather at the edges of the encampment. There was no sudden clamor, no trumpets announcing readiness. Instead, the call to arms was a subtle rhythm, understood through gesture, repetition, and the disciplined attention cultivated over countless days of observation and practice. A cluster of riders mounted horses with deliberate care. The creak of leather harnesses and the faint metallic jingle of small ornaments hung on bridles filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of animals and the lingering aroma of last night's fires. Each movement was deliberate, hands smoothed over reins, tightened straps, and adjusted bows resting against the horses' sides. The warriors did not hurry. Urgency here was measured and purposeful, embedded in the choreography of preparation rather than in outward haste. Even the way horses shifted their weight, stamping hooves against frost-hardened earth, was noted, absorbed, and aligned with the rhythm of human motion. Clan leaders moved among the warriors, issuing instructions with quiet authority. Their words were not loud proclamations but gentle, deliberate cues. A nod, a tilt of the head, a slight gesture of the hand. Observers watched intently, absorbing the subtleties of command, internalizing the rhythm of authority as much as the practical tasks being instructed. In this early moment, the hierarchy was not a matter of dominance, but of shared understanding and disciplined observation. The lessons of patience, attentiveness, and repetition that the steppe had taught were now being applied to coordination within the group. And slowly, deliberately, a sense of collective purpose emerged. The warriors tested their bows, drawing strings taut and releasing them with careful precision. Each movement was accompanied by the subtle creak of leather and the muted thump of arrows landing into prepared targets. The sound of tension in bowstrings, the vibration of wood beneath hands, and the shifting weight of the rider atop the horse formed a rhythm that was internal as much as external. With each repetition, the warriors refined their motions, their bodies learning instinctively the balance between control and release, between force and restraint. Reflection here was natural and meditative. Understanding that skill, honed through repetition and observation, was more powerful than brute haste. The assembly of warriors unfolded across the gentle contours of the steppe like a carefully orchestrated pattern. Hooves shifted in unison, the soft clop of movement mingling with the whisper of wind through grass. Some riders moved to check gear, adjusting sheaths and sharpening blades, while others studied the horizon for the first sign of movement from rival clans or distant herds. Each individual was aware not only of their own tasks, but of the collective rhythm of the group. In this early stage of mobilization, coordination was both practical and meditative, an internalization of shared attention and shared purpose. Children and adolescents often observed from the periphery, learning silently. They watched the careful mounting of horses, the attentive handling of weapons, and the meticulous preparation of provisions for travel. Through imitation and quiet reflection, they absorbed not only practical skill but the ethos of their people, patience, observation, and disciplined action as inseparable from power and survival. The repetition of preparation, the slow rhythm of mounting, adjusting, and testing, created a living lesson that would carry into adulthood, shaping the instinctual precision of warriors long before their first engagement. The sensory environment reinforced the meditative quality of the call to arms. The smell of fresh earth, mingled with the scent of horse sweat and the faint smoke of morning fires, enveloped the assembly. The sun rose higher, casting light that glinted off leather and metal, catching the eyes of riders as they adjusted to the glare. The soundscape was intricate yet understated, hooves tapping against frozen soil, leather shifting, distant low murmur of camp activity, and the whisper of the wind through the grass. Each element reinforced awareness, attention to detail, and the internal rhythm that governed movement and coordination. Beyond the immediate assembly, the steppe itself seemed to participate. Shadows lengthened and shifted as the sun climbed, altering perceptions of distance and depth. The scent of distant water carried faintly on the breeze, alerting scouts and riders alike to potential obstacles or opportunities. The soft sound of birds taking flight punctuated the quiet, offering additional information on environmental conditions. Every sensory input was a cue, absorbed consciously and unconsciously, forming the basis of instinctive response that would later define tactical movement. The call to arms also involved preparation of material needs. Warriors checked their quivers, counting arrows, and ensuring that each was correctly fletched and aligned. Swords were inspected for sharpness, the balance tested by feeling the weight in hand. Shields, light and reinforced, were adjusted and strapped. Each action was slow, deliberate, and measured, emphasizing careful repetition over hasty execution. Reflection during this process was internal. The warrior understood that preparation was as much mental as physical, a meditation in attention and self-discipline that would underpin the ability to act decisively when the time came. Movements extended to small logistical arrangements. Horses were guided into orderly patterns, tack adjusted to prevent discomfort, and provisions, dried meat, fermented milk, and minimal grain, were prepared for easy distribution. Each act of care for the animals and equipment reinforced the understanding that survival and success depended on meticulous attention to detail. The rhythm of repeated, careful action permeated the camp, creating a subtle cohesion, a quiet harmony between preparation and anticipation. As the morning advanced, warriors began to pair off, testing each other's reactions in controlled drills. Hooves shifted, bows were drawn, arrows released in measured arcs. There was no rush. Every movement was observed, absorbed, and internalized. Reflection focused on the principle that mastery was achieved not through force alone, but through understanding, repetition, and internalized rhythm. Each small success, each correction, each observation built toward the collective readiness of the group, preparing them for the larger, unpredictable movements of the horde across vast distances. The visual and tactile sensations reinforced internal reflection. Sunlight glimmered on wet leather, warmed the earth beneath hooves, and cast shifting shadows that revealed subtle contours of the terrain. Fingers felt the tautness of bowstrings, the texture of reins, and the balance of weight across a horse, back. These physical cues, repeated countless times, were embedded in memory and body, linking environment, skill, and internal awareness into a seamless whole. Communication during the call to arms remained quiet but deliberate. Leaders used gestures, eye contact, and measured speech to convey direction, with every instruction observed and practiced. The repetition of these signals over time created a shared understanding that transcended words. The slightest tilt of a hand, a shift of stance, or a subtle nod carried clear meaning to those trained to observe. In this way, coordination and hierarchy were reinforced not through force, but through attentive practice and internalized rhythm. By midday, the assembly of warriors had formed an almost imperceptible cadence. Hooves clopped softly in patterns that echoed the wind's whisper through grass, bows bent and released in a quiet, ongoing rhythm. Each rider understood their role within this choreography, their movements harmonizing with the movements of others. Reflection meditated on the interconnectedness of all things: horse and rider, environment and observer, preparation and action. Power, they realized, was born not from haste or strength alone, but from the quiet mastery of repetition, observation, and internalized discipline. The call to arms was not an event of sudden action but a slow, deliberate process, a meditation in movement and readiness. It was an enactment of the collective wisdom of generations who had learned the rhythms of the steppe and the patterns of life upon it. The assembly taught patience, attention, and the subtle understanding of hierarchy. It emphasized that strength lay in the coordination of many, not the heroics of one, that preparation was inseparable from perception, and that the slow, repeated actions of disciplined practice forged an invisible but powerful cohesion. As the sun arced higher, the warriors completed their preparations. Horses nickered softly, shifting weight, while riders took a final moment to observe the expanse before them. The wind carried distant scents and sounds, the faint clatter of other tents, the grazing of animals, the far-off call of birds. Scouts rode to the edges of the camp, ensuring that movements remained unnoticed and that readiness was preserved. Every observation, every measured movement, every repetition of skill reinforced the internal rhythm that would define the Mongol horde in both daily life and wartime. Internal reflection lingered, the quiet understanding that the call to arms was as much a mental preparation as a physical one, that discipline, patience, and observation were inseparable from power, that the rhythms of the steppe shaped not only survival but strategy, coordination, and unity. The warriors absorbed these lessons slowly, deliberately, embedding them into both body and mind, readying themselves for the movements that would carry their people across the vast expanse of Asia. By afternoon, the assembly had reached its conclusion. Horses shifted in unison, bows rested briefly in quivers, and the soft clatter of hooves receded into quiet observation. The call to arms, though now complete, had left its imprint, a silent, pervasive rhythm of preparation, awareness, and collective purpose that would resonate through every subsequent action of the horde. In the quiet that followed, the Mongols understood the slow, deliberate power of coordination, and the enduring lesson that mastery, unity, and readiness came not from haste, but from patient repetition and attentive observation. The steppe stretched endlessly around them, its grasses waving gently in the afternoon breeze, its contours traced by shadow and light. The lessons of the morning, the repetition, the rhythm, the measured motions, would carry forward into the journeys, battles, and strategies yet to come. The call to arms had been more than preparation. It had been a meditation, a rhythm internalized, a bridge between observation and action, patience and power, individual skill and collective mastery. The Mongols, silent and attentive, absorbed the land, the movement, and each other, ready to translate these subtle, repeated lessons into the art of war that would make them a force unlike any other. The steppe stretched endlessly under a pale morning sun, the grass bending softly with each breath of wind, dew glinting like scattered jewels on its tips. The horde moved quietly, a measured procession of riders and animals threading across the undulating terrain. There was no hurry, only the rhythm of deliberate motion, the slow pulse of life attuned to land, weather, and animal alike. Each horse, each rider, each sound, hooves tapping against frost-kissed soil, the creak of leather harnesses, the soft murmur of conversation, melded into an intricate harmony, almost imperceptible yet deeply felt by those who moved within it. Crossing rivers required particular attention. Streams ran low in some stretches, shallow and icy, curling around smooth stones and mud-laden banks. Riders slowed their mounts, feeling each step as hooves sank briefly into the soft riverbed, lifting again with precise timing. Water lapped against legs and shoes, carrying scents of silt, algae, and the faint metallic tang of iron-rich soil. Tiny ripples radiated outward with each hoofall, shimmering in the sunlight, reflecting fragmented images of sky and cloud. The horses sensed the change in footing, shifting their weight with instinctual care, muscles flexing in small, continuous adjustments. Riders absorbed this motion, letting the tactile feedback of stirrups, reins, and shifting balance guide every next step. Some crossings were steeper or swifter, rivers swollen from distant rains, their surfaces dark and glimmering. Scouts moved first, guiding the path with careful observation, reading the water's patterns and the subtle flow of current around submerged stones. The wind carried their faint voices downstream, mingling with the rush of water and the occasional bird call. Observers, other riders, absorbed the rhythm of these movements, internalizing the silent language of terrain and water. Each successful crossing reinforced the lesson that patience, observation, and attention to subtle cues could render obstacles manageable, even graceful. Hills rose gently but persistently across the landscape, Riders adjusted to these undulations, sensing the change in incline through both body and horse. Each ascent demanded slight shifts of weight, careful distribution of balance, and a subtle change in pace. The soundscape changed too. Hooves clopped with a different cadence on the upward slope. The scrape of hooves against harder soil echoed faintly, and the whisper of grass under movement grew sharper. When descending, riders leaned forward, reins taut, adjusting to maintain control over momentum. The hills were neither rushed nor feared. Instead, they were observed, measured, and integrated into the continuous rhythm of movement. The sensory immersion of the journey extended beyond touch and sound. The smell of the steppe changed with terrain and proximity to water. Earthy dampness by the river, dry, sun-warmed grass on the hills. The faint scent of animal sweat mingled with lingering smoke from distant fires. The sun rose higher, casting warm light that glinted off leather metal fittings and the dewy tips of grass. Shadows lengthened and shifted as the horde moved, revealing subtle contours in the land, offering cues about slopes, hollows, and potential ambush points. Awareness of these visual subtleties became second nature, internalized through repetition, observation, and reflection. The riders themselves moved in quiet coordination. The order of horses, the spacing between individuals, and the rhythm of forward motion were all carefully maintained. Scouts, positioned slightly ahead or on the flanks, absorbed every detail of terrain and horizon, signaling subtle cues to those following. These signals, small gestures, shifts in posture, or the slight nod of a hand, conveyed complex information without a single spoken word. The repetition of these movements, day after day, crossing river after hill, transformed observation into instinct, awareness into strategy. The horde moved as a cohesive organism, each part attentive, each part learning from the other, all attuned to the pulse of the land. Within this slow progression, moments of reflection arose naturally. Riders gazed across valleys, noting how sunlight played on distant ridges, how shadows revealed hidden hollows, and how the soft haze of morning suggested moisture or frost. There was time to observe the movement of birds overhead, the patterns of clouds, and the subtle whisper of wind through grass, each offering information, each reinforcing the lesson that careful attention, not haste, was the key to mastery. Internal reflection deepened, understanding that mobility was not simply the act of moving from point A to B, but a continuous engagement with the environment, an ongoing meditation on rhythm, balance, and perception. Horses themselves were more than mere instruments of movement. They were partners, requiring care and understanding. Riders adjusted saddles and harnesses mid-journey, feeling for signs of discomfort, and allowed horses brief moments to graze when the pace permitted. The tactile feedback of hooves on earth, the warmth of a horse's flank underhand, and the subtle shift of muscle beneath the rider provided constant communication. Reflection emphasized empathy and attentiveness, recognizing that the endurance of the horde relied equally on animal and human alike. This partnership, honed over years of repetition and observation, created a flow of movement that was almost seamless, each step synchronized with breath, muscle, and mind. Rest periods were brief but deliberate. The horde paused at elevated vantage points, offering clear views across the plains, rivers, and distant hills. Horses were allowed to drink from streams, hooves and muzzles disturbing water in gentle arcs, creating concentric ripples that shimmered in sunlight. Scouts walked along the edges of the assembly, scanning for distant movement or subtle changes in terrain. In these pauses, riders inhaled the scents of the steppe, noted the play of light on distant ridges, and allowed the quiet rhythm of travel to settle into internal reflection. Every breath, every glance, every subtle adjustment reinforced the collective memory of movement across this vast and challenging environment. Encounters with natural obstacles were meditative exercises in patience and adaptation. Streams, patches of ice, or sudden rises in terrain required careful thought and incremental action. Horses shifted weight, Riders adjusted posture, and small decisions were made repeatedly, consciously and unconsciously. Reflection emphasized that strategy was not always imposed from above, but emerged organically from the ongoing dialogue between environment, animal, and human attention. Each successful passage reinforced confidence and internalized knowledge, creating a rhythm of mastery that would carry the horde across continents. The sensory tapestry of this movement was rich and layered. The soft jingle of harnesses, the faint scent of horse sweat, the rustle of grass under hooves, and the shifting play of light and shadow across hills all contributed to a continuous awareness of environment. Eyes scanned the horizon while hands felt the tension of reins, the weight of bows, and the balance of bodies atop horses. Each layer of perception contributed to a subtle, internalized map of the steppe, guiding future movement, decisions, and strategy. Even as the horde moved silently across rivers and hills, there was an implicit rhythm in the repetition of tasks, adjusting tack, guiding animals, observing terrain, coordinating movement. Each repetition deepened understanding, cultivated patience, and honed skill. Internal reflection embraced this rhythm, recognizing that the Mongols' power lay not in sudden action alone, but in the disciplined, repeated engagement with environment, animal, and human connection. By mid-afternoon, the horde had traversed a series of hills and streams, each passage reinforcing the interconnected lessons of patience, observation, and rhythm. The landscape in its vastness became a teacher. Every slope, every bend in a river, every rise of grass whispered subtle truths about movement, endurance, and strategy. The riders absorbed these lessons slowly, deeply, their bodies and minds attuned to every nuance of the land. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in soft golds and pale reds, the horde reached a plateau overlooking a wide river valley. Horses nickered softly, hooves stamping lightly on earth, while riders paused to absorb the breadth of view. The wind carried the scent of water and wet soil, the distant call of birds, and the faint hum of insects along the riverbank. Reflection deepened. The steppe was not merely a space to traverse, but a living, breathing entity whose patterns dictated movement, survival, and strategy. Observation, patience, and repeated practice transformed this vastness into a canvas for mastery. The final moments of the day were spent establishing temporary control over this new terrain. Scouts marked vantage points, horses were allowed brief grazing, and riders adjusted gear in preparation for the coming nightfall. Every action was slow, deliberate, and measured, reinforcing the rhythm of movement learned over centuries. Internal reflection lingered on the lessons of the day: adaptation, coordination, and the seamless integration of human, animal, and environment into a singular, disciplined flow. As dusk approached, the horde paused along a gentle riverbank, water rippling under the soft touch of wind. Shadows lengthened, blending horse, rider, and terrain into a single, quiet tableau. The internal rhythm cultivated over the day, the weight of reins, the pulse of hooves, the patterns of light and shadow, settled into a meditative calm. Movement had become artful, strategic, and deeply reflective. The Mongols, silent yet alert, understood that the mastery of rivers and hills was a rehearsal for the vast, complex, and unpredictable landscapes yet to come. In this slow, immersive rhythm, the horde's journey across rivers and hills was more than mere passage. It was a meditation in motion, a lesson in observation, patience, and discipline. Each step, each adjustment, each breath absorbed the wisdom of generations. That endurance, coordination, and strategic awareness emerged not from haste but from careful, repeated, attentive engagement with every detail of terrain, animal, and human movement. By the time night began to fall, the horde had internalized a rhythm that would guide them across the steppe for miles and years, moving with silent power, unity, and purpose. Evening settled gently across the steppe, the light softening into shades of amber and muted gold. The wind carried a subtle chill, bending tall grasses and rippling the surface of small streams that meandered lazily through low-lying valleys. Horses nickered softly as they grazed, heads dipping to the earth to taste the sparse, dry blades, their breath misting in the cooling air. The horde slowed its pace, the steady rhythm of travel giving way to measured, deliberate preparation for nightfall. Movement became quieter, softer, attuned to the settling of shadows and the changing scent of the land, earthy, cool, and tinged with the faint aroma of animal sweat and trampled grass. Felt tents were arranged in careful patterns, each positioned with attention to wind direction, proximity to water, and visibility across the surrounding terrain. Smoke curled from small hearths within these temporary structures, spiraling lazily into the evening air, mingling with the scent of cooking milk and the faint tang of charred wood. Within the tents, women moved with calm precision, tending fires, arranging bedding, and preparing evening meals. Each motion was repetitive, familiar, and purposeful, the scraping of a wooden bowl, the gentle kneading of dough, the rhythmic stirring of thick, warming liquids. These domestic rituals, repeated day after day, reinforced cohesion, patience, and resilience within the moving community. Outside, men adjusted tack, checked leather straps, and ensured that weapons were clean and ready. The clinking of metal and the soft creak of stretched leather punctuated the evening air, mingling with distant bird calls and the low murmur of horses. Scouts returned from the periphery, moving cautiously, their eyes scanning the horizon, noting the position of other clans or signs of predators. Their reports were brief, often conveyed through a single gesture or a low murmur, yet their presence shaped the rhythm of the entire camp. Attention was focused, measured, yet not hurried, the entire group attuned to subtle cues that would guide actions if disturbance or danger arose. Children who had spent the day running alongside herds now moved more quietly. Some played near the edges of the camp, their laughter soft and fleeting, harmonizing with the low whicker of horses and the occasional bark of a small dog. Others helped with minor tasks, carrying firewood, tending water containers, or watching the behavior of younger animals under the watchful eye of an elder. The repetition of these small duties, integrated seamlessly into the flow of daily life, created a rhythm of training and observation, instilling awareness, patience, and careful coordination from an early age. As darkness deepened, the sky above unfurled a vast indigo canopy. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then gradually more vivid, scattered across the heavens like a slow-spreading net of light. The wind carried a whisper through the grass, a quiet accompaniment to the shifting patterns of shadow and glow. Riders and villagers alike lifted their gaze upward, tracing constellations and noting the position of celestial bodies. These nightly observations were more than idle fascination. They were part of a slow, meditative rhythm that connected the movement of people and animals to the cycles of the world itself. Knowledge of stars and moonlight helped scouts navigate, guided the placement of tents, and reinforced the quiet discipline that sustained life on the steppe. Nightfall also brought subtle lessons in vigilance. The horde was never completely at rest. Even as bodies relaxed and fires burned low, eyes remained alert. Patterns of shadows shifted with the flicker of firelight, and the soft clatter of hooves on frozen earth or the rustle of grass could signal movement miles away. Scouts moved in short, deliberate loops beyond the tents, attentive to every scent and sound. Horses, too, responded to subtle shifts in wind and light, pricking ears, snorting softly, or shifting weight in place. The interplay between animal instinct and human observation created a silent, continuous rhythm, allowing the horde to rest while maintaining readiness for any unforeseen challenge. Meal preparation in the evening followed a slow, deliberate sequence. Milk from mares was warmed and churned, yielding a thick, creamy texture, the aroma blending with that of roasted grains and small portions of preserved meat. Wooden bowls were handed from hand to hand, filled with sustenance for both people and animals. Each motion was familiar, comforting, repeated across countless nights. Eating became a communal act, a moment of pause that reaffirmed bonds of cooperation and shared dependence. Reflection here lingered on the quiet coordination of tasks. how rhythm, repetition, and mutual care created the foundation for endurance, mobility, and resilience across the vast steppe. The Horde's temporary encampments were also places of subtle learning and planning. Leaders walked among tents, observing the placement of fires, the distribution of animals, and the condition of supplies. Instructions were given softly, in measured tones, each word weighted with purpose. The process was unhurried, yet deliberate, emphasizing observation, understanding, and the importance of repetition. Internal reflection revealed how the careful orchestration of space, resources, and human activity laid the groundwork for both survival and strategic capacity. These encampments, though transient, were microcosms of order, demonstrating that even in constant movement, structure could be maintained through attentiveness and deliberate practice. As night deepened further, fires dwindled to glowing embers, casting gentle light across the assembled tents and grazing horses. Shadows lengthened, blending forms together, creating a soft, hypnotic visual rhythm. The faint murmur of voices, the occasional clatter of a tool, and the distant whinny of a horse combined into a layered soundscape that was at once dynamic and calming. Observers in this environment absorbed the patterns, how light and shadow shifted, how movement flowed, how the living landscape of humans, animals, and land interacted in continuous, measured cycles. Reflection deepened. The Mongols' success depended as much on internalizing these rhythms as on physical skill or strategy. The night also offered moments of introspection for individuals. Riders and scouts, walking along the edges of camp, considered the events of the day, the rivers crossed, hills traversed, subtle signs noted, animals guided. The soft ground beneath their feet, the cold air brushing skin, the smell of wet soil and horse, and the endless expanse of grass and sky prompted contemplation of both environment and self. Each observation was catalogued mentally, forming a living map of terrain, weather, and social dynamics, reinforcing the discipline and patient awareness that allowed the horde to operate across vast distances with precision. Stars overhead became guides not only for navigation, but also for rhythm. Certain constellations marked the time to rest, the time to prepare, or the time to move. Their slow, predictable paths mirrored the patterns of the horde's own movements, offering a sense of continuity amid the temporary nature of encampments. Reflection here emphasized the interdependence of human activity and cosmic patterns, how attentiveness to larger cycles provided both practical guidance and meditative comfort. Even the arrangement of horses within the camp held significance. Leaders ensured that mounts were positioned for both safety and efficiency, with grazers at strategic edges, foals clustered near mares, and the strongest, most alert horses closest to potential points of approach. The process was slow, methodical, and repeated each night, a ritual in its own right, underscoring the subtle art of foresight, protection, and shared responsibility. The tactile experience, adjusting bridles, feeling the warmth of a flank, noting subtle shifts in posture, reinforced the deep, almost meditative bond between rider and animal. Nightfall also allowed time for storytelling and reflection within tents. Elders recounted lessons of the steppe, tales of past journeys, and principles of strategy and observation. Words were drawn out slowly, emphasizing rhythm and repetition, reinforcing memory and shared cultural knowledge. The smell of smoke, the warmth of gathered bodies, and the gentle crackle of embers created an immersive environment in which learning and reflection were intertwined. The narrative of past experiences, told and retold in measured cadence, became part of the living rhythm of the horde, linking past, present, and future in quiet, continuous flow. As darkness reached its zenith, a stillness descended across the camp. The steppe, vast and open, seemed to hold its breath alongside the horde. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying distant calls of nocturnal birds and the faint rustle of small animals in undergrowth. Horses shifted weight occasionally, snorted softly, and grazed with slow deliberation. Humans, too, settled into measured breathing, listening, observing, and internalizing the patterns that surrounded them. Reflection lingered on the subtle unity of the night. Movement and rest, observation and reflection, preparation and pause, all woven together in a continuous living rhythm. The Mongols' encampments at night were not merely places of rest but crucibles of discipline, observation, and internalized structure. Each day's movement, each river crossed, each hill climbed culminated here in quiet contemplation, rehearsal, and learning. The repetition of tasks, the careful placement of animals, the measured coordination of human activity, and the attentive awareness of the environment reinforced skills essential for survival, mobility, and strategic mastery. Nightfall was as instructive as any day spent on the move, teaching patience, observation, and the silent integration of human and animal activity into the natural rhythms of the steppe. By the end of the evening, the horde had settled into a profound calm. Fires burned low, horses grazed with relaxed attentiveness, and tents stood in deliberate arrangements. The wind carried the lingering warmth of day, mingled with the cool scent of night, and the stars above traced their eternal paths. Internal reflection echoed the lessons of movement and preparation. Patience, rhythm, and subtle observation sustained life, reinforced unity, and provided the framework for the vast, coordinated power that the horde could wield when the dawn came again. In this serene, measured setting, nightfall on the steppe became a meditation. The horde existed in continuous dialogue with environment, animal, and self, cultivating skills and awareness that would allow them to move like a silent storm across the vastness of Asia. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, every glint of starlight contributed to the collective memory, rhythm, and discipline of the Mongols. Here, amid smoke, embers, and grazing horses, the quiet foundation of endurance, cohesion, and strategy was laid, not through haste or force, but through patience, observation, and the careful, repetitive practice of living in harmony with the rhythm of the steppe. Dawn stretched slowly over the steppe, casting a muted golden light across the undulating plains. The cold of night lingered in pockets of shadow, curling around tufts of grass, drifting across shallow depressions where frost still clung stubbornly. Horses shifted beneath their riders, their breath rising in fine mist, hooves stirring frost-hardened earth. The horde assembled quietly, movements deliberate, soft, yet imbued with a latent, contained energy. The air was filled with the faint clinking of harnesses, the whisper of leather straps adjusting against the warmth of horse flanks, and the low, measured murmur of leaders assigning positions. Even in this quiet, the presence of strategy was palpable. Riders moved in slow arcs across the plain, tracing invisible lines, practicing the subtle balance of weight, balance, and communication. Each bowstring was drawn with care, not hastily, the tension felt through fingers and arms, the release studied and controlled. Hooves followed patterns, trampling the earth in precise, rehearsed rhythms. The repetition of these movements was more than training. It was an embodiment of coordination, discipline, and anticipation, a dance that fused instinct with deliberate attention. Leaders circled, observing. Their eyes were slow and patient, noting the placement of each rider, the angle of the horse's neck, the way hands rested on reins, the tilt of bows ready to draw. Every small adjustment was noted, internalized, and corrected without haste. A subtle gesture, a tilt of the hand, a soft nod, the shifting of weight, conveyed instructions more efficiently than words ever could. This quiet guidance, repeated over days and nights, taught each member to understand and anticipate not only their own movement, but that of the group, creating a tacit, shared knowledge that extended beyond the spoken command. The wind drifted across the plain, carrying scents of damp earth, trampled grass, and faint smoke from distant fires. Riders attuned themselves to these signals, noting shifts in direction, intensity, and consistency. Scouts returned intermittently from the edges of the steppe, reporting observations in measured tones. Their words were few, their presence deliberate. The horde relied as much on the subtle information carried by wind, terrain, and animal behavior as it did on direct orders. Internal reflection emphasized the deep interconnection between observation and action, the quiet, patient acquisition of situational awareness that would later allow the horde to strike with precision across continents. The process of practicing formations unfolded slowly, almost meditative in its rhythm. Riders traced arcs and lines across the frost-touched ground, occasionally pausing to correct posture, realign spacing, or adjust the timing of a turn. Bowstrings were tested, restrung, and released repeatedly, each motion measured, the sound absorbed into the vast silence of the steppe. The clatter of hooves on hard ground, the faint twang of strings, and the low murmur of horses' breaths formed a layered, hypnotic cadence. Observers could sense the subtle tension in each individual, held not in fear, but in anticipation, awareness, and focus. At intervals, the leaders gathered smaller groups, demonstrating tactics in miniature. They moved slowly, emphasizing precision over speed, showing how riders could pivot, flank, or converge, all while maintaining a constant awareness of their neighbors and the terrain. These drills were repeated with gentle insistence, the same motions practiced again and again until muscle memory transformed them into instinct. Each repetition reinforced unity, patience, and a subtle understanding of spatial relationships, the invisible threads connecting rider, horse, and the collective force of the horde. The sensory environment played its part in this education of rhythm and discipline. Frost sparkled on grass blades like a fine lattice of crystal, the low morning sun glinting off the tips. Horses shivered occasionally, tails flicking, ears pricking at distant sounds. The scent of warm leather, horse sweat, and the occasional tang of river water in nearby gullies mixed with the cold air, grounding participants in their surroundings. Each sensory detail was absorbed consciously, contributing to a holistic awareness that allowed riders to anticipate, react, and coordinate with subtlety and efficiency. Children who had observed and imitated their elders for years moved alongside the practicing warriors in small arcs, running alongside young horses, mimicking posture, weight, and timing. Their motions were tentative but purposeful, guided by repetition and observation rather than instruction. Internal reflection here emphasized the continuity of learning, the quiet transmission of knowledge through lived experience, through immersion in practice, rhythm, and careful attention to the environment. Even at play, the young absorbed the principles that would one day allow them to move as part of a vast, synchronized force. As midday approached, the horde paused briefly. Fires flickered gently in small hearths, and the aroma of warm milk, roasted grains, and lightly cooked meat drifted across the plain. Riders took slow sips from leather flasks, hands absently tracing reins and straps, fingers brushing against the coarse hair of their mounts. This pause was neither idle nor unproductive. It reinforced reflection, allowed observation, and deepened the connection between human and animal. Every aspect of sustenance was considered, repeated, and attuned to the needs of both rider and steed. The rhythm of eating, drinking, and breathing was synchronized with the patterns of movement, embedding patience and attentiveness in even the most mundane activities. After rest, drills resumed with a slow, methodical rhythm. Groups practiced approaching, withdrawing, encircling, and concentrating forces, all under the watchful eyes of leaders whose gestures were subtle yet potent. Each movement was synchronized with that of others, a tacit choreography that relied on observation, memory, and anticipation rather than shouted orders. Reflection lingered on the way discipline and shared rhythm transformed individuals into a cohesive, almost organic force, able to move as a single entity across vast expanses of terrain with a speed and precision that seemed to defy scale. The environment itself provided lessons. Hills, gullies, rivers, and wind patterns were studied carefully, their shapes memorized, their effects on movement considered and integrated into strategy. Horses adjusted naturally, sensing slight gradients in soft soil. Riders, attuned to the animal's subtle shifts, maintained balance and timing. Dust rising from hoofbeats formed fleeting markers across the plain, signaling positions, directions, and timing. Internal reflection highlighted the deep interdependence between observation, adaptation, and disciplined practice, the very foundation of the Mongols' strategic mastery. By late afternoon, the horde engaged in a final series of movements designed to test coordination. Riders converged in slow, deliberate arcs, feinting and withdrawing in patterns that seemed almost ritualized. Arrows were drawn and released with precision, measured to avoid conflict but designed to reinforce timing and accuracy. The air resonated with the soft twang of strings, the muted thump of hooves, and the whisper of wind through grass. The combination of sound, movement, and tactile sensation created a layered, meditative environment in which reflection, learning, and mastery were inseparable. Even as the drills concluded and the horde slowed to a grazing and resting pattern, the internalization of rhythm persisted. Riders noted subtle shifts in posture, micro-adjustments in movement, and the timing of breath in both horse and human. Observation, repetition, and reflection had transformed simple drills into instinct, the quiet foundation of coordinated action ready to be deployed across the vast landscapes of Asia. Discipline was no longer external. It was absorbed into muscle, bone, and perception, creating a force that was both precise and fluid. As dusk settled, the plain was bathed in a muted glow, long shadows stretching across the grass, highlighting the patterns of movement practiced throughout the day. Horses grazed quietly, their heads moving in synchronized arcs, occasionally flicking ears at distant sounds. The wind carried the smell of dust, grass, and wood smoke, mingling with the faint tang of sweat from exertion. Leaders walked slowly among the formations, observing without intrusion, allowing the rhythm of practice to continue subtly even in stillness. Internal reflection emphasized the quiet power of accumulated practice. Discipline, observation, and shared rhythm were the invisible threads that bound the horde together, creating both cohesion and latent strength. The stars began to emerge, faint at first, then more distinctly, guiding the horde's orientation and reminding them of the scale of the steppe. The knowledge of celestial patterns, coupled with the disciplined practice of movement, reinforced an almost meditative awareness of both space and time. Observing these rhythms, internal reflection deepened. Mastery of strategy was not merely learned in battle. It was cultivated in daily life, in repetitive practice, in alignment with natural and cosmic patterns. By nightfall, the horde had established a calm, ordered presence across the plain. Fires burned low, embers glowing in gentle patterns. Horses rested with subtle alertness. Riders adjusted blankets, harnesses, and reins in quiet, habitual motions. The air was filled with the soft whisper of wind, the occasional nicker of a horse, and the faint rustle of grass. Reflection lingered on the invisible yet tangible power cultivated through patient repetition, disciplined practice, and acute awareness. This rhythm, the subtle combination of movement, observation, and reflection, was the essence of the Mongols' silent storm, the mechanism by which a mobile, cohesive force could emerge from the vast expanse of steppe. Every element of this day, observation of terrain, movement of horses, practice of formations, attention to sustenance, awareness of wind and weather, was a lesson in patience, strategy, and unity. The Mongols' mastery of discipline and coordination was as much internal as external, cultivated through careful repetition and reflection. They moved not merely as individuals, but as a single, living system, attuned to each other and to the rhythms of the world around them. In the quiet of the approaching night, the horde rested yet remained vigilant, embodying the cumulative lessons of movement, observation, and practice. The steppe stretched endlessly, wind-swept and vast, yet within this openness, the horde's disciplined presence carved patterns of coordination, rhythm, and latent power. The subtle repetition of daily practice, attention to detail, and reflection upon each movement created the foundation for an extraordinary capacity, one that would allow the Mongols to move like a silent storm, striking with precision and cohesion across territories unimaginable in scale. Here, amid frost-kissed grass, grazing horses, and fatting light, the essence of strategy and discipline was revealed, not in moments of loud triumph, but in the quiet, repetitive, and reflective practice of living in harmony with rhythm, environment, and shared purpose. The Mongols' enduring strength, patience, and mastery were cultivated in these daily rituals, in the meticulous observation of self, animal, and land, and in the seamless integration of individual skill into collective action. And so, as night enveloped the steppe, the horde rested, fully present, fully aware, their silent coordination echoing across the plains, a testament to discipline honed through repetition, reflection, and rhythm. The foundation of empire, of conquest, and of mobility was neither loud nor immediate. It was slow, patient, and deeply internalized, a quiet force that would sweep across Asia like wind across grass, precise, relentless, and impossible to resist.